So thank you for coming to EventHuddle this evening. We have a slight change in the advertised plan in that the lovely Kevin Jackson's not here, and so you've got myself standing in for himself. I'm Robert Dunsmore. I'm a freelance creative director. And we've got an esteemed panel. We've had one dropout, which is Brendan Chilton, who was the leader of the Labour Out movement. He's not been able to make it. He had a previous appointment. He was always going to be tight, but he can't make it now. So we've got Jeremy, who's very kindly stood in for him. So I'm going to introduce you to our esteemed panel, and then we've got a few questions that have been posted before, and I'm going to ask each of the panel to just give themselves an introduction so that you have an idea who you're actually talking to, and at the end of their 1 or 2 minute introduction, I'd just like them to express whether they're an in or an out. And before we do that, since we've got a lovely turnout here, you can be agnostic if you want to, that doesn't matter. If we've got a good turnout here, just at the beginning of the evening and at the end of the evening at 7 o'clock, we're going to repeat this. Can we just have a show of hands? Who is generally, in tribal terms, for staying in? And who generally, in tribal terms, is for out?
Excellent.
Let's see whether or not there's any change at the end of the evening. So first and foremost, can I introduce our one and only lady member of the panel. So this is Nicky Havelaar, who is the MD of agency Crown. She has a lot of experience working with both corporate and with in the public sector. To her left, we have Simon Hughes, who after best part of a decade at the COI is a corporate consultant for MCHA. Tremendous amount of experience working with the public purses and presenting our government and working overseas, of course. Nick de Bois, to my right, was the founder of event agency Rapier, who a lot of you may know from way back, and has since pursued a political career. He's been an MP and is currently working on a more local London affair, but representing himself this evening. And then we have on my extreme right, on your left, we have a safe pair of hands with an easy manner, according to his website, which I've read briefly before. Jeremy Jacobs, who has just joined us, who's going to give us more of a media angle, because he's been a broadcaster and presenter for the best part of 20 years, interviewed lots of politicians, so it'd be very, very interesting to see what opinions he brings to the market. So the first question that we've got here from Alan is, if we leave the EU, what would be the impact on our industry in terms of opportunity and practical delivery? So, impact on our industry in terms of opportunity. Can I ask you, Simon, to kick off with that?
Yeah.
We've got the thing.
Can you actually hear us without them? Yeah. Right.
Isn't that for the broadcast?
But for the yeah, appreciate for the broadcast at all.
For the sake of the broadcast.
If we could, a duet, please. Simon.
Keep going. Okay. Men are really completely carried away.
It is not the Eurovision Song Contest.
Very good. Okay. What I was going to say was, I was talking to a whole bunch of people last night at a reception that I was with the EvCom members, and I mentioned this conversation this evening, and one of the things I mentioned was carnets. What does it mean to this industry if we're suddenly out of Europe? It means that every single shipment you send across into European countries, you would have to write down every single piece of kit. And I was actually trying to find a carnet so I could kind of wave it in a theatrical manner and say, hey, remember this, because this was hell. Because a lot of people listening to me right now are thinking, what's he talking about? Carnets? Isn't those the things you buy on the metro where you get 17 trips for the price of 15? But the reality is, going out of Europe, I think, would reintroduce a huge number of small, but nonetheless irritating barriers that we'd have to jump over in order to do business. And as an industry, we've already got quite a lot to cope with in terms of doing good business. And to put more impediments in our way in terms of silly regulations, in terms of having to reform employment laws, in terms of having to actually think about the way that we do business. Right now, the CEO of EasyJet has clearly come out in favour of staying in Europe by saying, my business, EasyJet, would not exist if it wasn't for the EU. And if you've got to do a recce in Milan tomorrow, and then you've got to run off and check out somewhere in Paris the day after, right now, dead easy to do. We're out of Europe, it would be a different story. And I think those are the issues, from my point of view, in terms of that particular question.
So no positives.
No positives.
Nick?
Well, of course, to answer the question, it's extremely difficult to answer the question, because if we do come out of Europe, the reality is we are going to enter into a new arrangement with Europe that would no doubt address the only issue that we'd be interested in here tonight specifically, which is trade. So if you look at the existing arrangements with countries that have chosen not to join the EU, and if you look at Norway, you look at Sweden, you will find that they have effectively created their own group arrangements through trade agreements called EFTA or similar. And they will, if you wish, probably do away with the carnets, which some of us in this room are old enough to remember and have filled out. I agree. But rather than focus necessarily on a specific issue there, I think we ought to take a step back as our industry and actually ask ourselves, what is the future of this industry? Where will our business be spread in the next 10, 20, 30 years? And what we can't overlook is that the European market that we are trading with, of all the world's markets, is the one that is in decline. It is not the growing market. And I would just pose the question that if we wanted to open up new trade agreements with emerging and successful economies, isn't that a better alternative to align ourselves with growing successful economies than necessarily forever commit ourselves to a declining economy?
And I'll come to Jeremy in a minute, but can I just bring Nicky in on this? You mentioned about the European, the decline of the European market. It's still worth 50% of the trade that we have in, with the UK, just under 50, yeah, 48.9%, 17% with the States, 17% in the other countries, which is going to grow, but that decline is still from an extremely high point. Nicky, you have a point to make.
Yeah, I hear what Nick's saying, but I'm wondering whether you can't have your cake and eat it and be part of the European Union and have trade agreements with the emerging markets.
You can't, not under legislation. That's the problem. We have given up every right to negotiate our own trade agreements with anyone else in the world. It is actually a sole competence of the EU. But you're right, it doesn't have to be binary. It is not all trade with Europe or no trade with Europe. Far from it. Sorry, I was answering that question.
Yeah, I didn't know that, and I think, sorry, I hate, to sort of represent some of the more ignorant people about the subject who've been probably having their nose to the grindstone trying to get some business in. It's tough enough as it is. So I wonder whether, it's for the first time I hear an argument against it, and that's just, there is no information, I'm sorry. But,
I agree.
And there is no specific information that is relevant to us. This is the problem. There's the bigger picture, but you're kind of thinking, what does it mean to me? And that's what we need to advocate in our, if we are going to vote on it, then we need to do that with a certain amount of knowledge. And I believe that, hopefully, I'm speaking for quite a lot of people who are just too busy doing business and have no understanding of what the impact is going to be.
And Jeremy, to come to you, both of your microphones work perfectly well, gentlemen. It's only these two down here. Coming back to the question, which was the impact on our industry and opportunities, does it make a difference to us if we were to exit?
Well, we've got a couple of examples here. I mean, Simon raised an interesting point. I don't think if this country left the European Union would have this mountain of paperwork. I think we should sort of look at our own strength as an industry and as individuals in the country as well. And the UK is a wonderful place to be. I see no reason why we can't hold our own on our own and trading with Europe. and the rest of the world. So I think Nick raised some good points as well. I think we should, really have the courage of our convictions and just get on with it, whether it's in the events industry or in the other industry. Coming back to your point about 50%, I mean, I think a few years on television, someone said, well, actually, it's not 50%, it's not as much as that. It's nearly 50% because most of the hard goods go into Rotterdam and Europort and then to the rest of the world. Yeah. So I don't know where we are, whether it's 50%, 40%, 30%. There's this mass confusion, and what concerns me, come the referendum, people will be in a quandary as to who to vote and where to vote.
Actually, Robert, just to add, just to build on that particular point, one of the things about reading around this to kind of try and form a view is that there are lots of academic studies about whether or not we should stay in or leave. There's reports from HM Treasury, there's reports from the Bank of England. So there's lots of kind of views on what the actual position is in terms of what it would do for us as an economy. But the one thing that is clear is that nobody has yet produced the definitive report that makes the argument one way or the other. And the Bank of England in particular are saying, there's lots of interesting stuff out there, lots of opinions and views, but there's nothing that nails the argument. And that, I think, is a real issue, is that a lot of us are kind of going, well, yeah, it could be, but on the other hand, it might not be. I think that's a challenge. In terms of the last referendum we had here in the UK, there was a very clear picture drawn by people in Scotland of what the choice was. And the SNP did a fantastic job of painting the future. This is what we'll do about this. This is how we'll fund that. This is where we're going to go in terms of investing in infrastructure. This is how we're going to handle the declining oil industry. They painted a really compelling picture of what independence for Scotland would look like. Nobody's painting a compelling picture of whether in or out is best.
Yes, and then there's, if I can just butt in there is the great unknown. I mean, who would have thought 5 years ago there would be 7,000 people at Calais in a jungle? And it's like an hour and a half away from where we're sitting. I mean, anything can happen. And whatever the rights and wrongs of that particular situation, I think as appalling as it exists in the first place.
Please.
So, I think the other thing is that, as in business, you have to make swift decisions. You have to be informed, you have to have your facts. The problem that I have with it is that I agree with Simon in terms of, any barrier, I try to take away because it makes business much easier. And it is, as I already said, business is extremely difficult at the moment. So, if you have to worry about all sorts of additional processes, it's not going to help. But one of the things that I kind of conflicted about, we've got this kind of Great Britain image, and I'm wondering whether the whole debate about in or out gives us, is chipping away at that and is actually damaging it. If I was dithering about my business and the direction it was going in, it would have a damaging effect. So this might have as well.
And I think that's why even the Prime Minister and the government want this referendum. I think they're worried about the timing, but the reality is I think if we had a long delay, it would not be good for Britain because it could theoretically undermine confidence.
But can I just say, one of my biggest concern is that somebody in Kirby Stephen up in Cumbria, near close to my heart, is going to be voting more emotionally and probably persuaded by the press. And so I kind of feel, I'm not in control of my own destiny. I don't, I know potentially how it might be relevant or irrelevant to my business, but there's going to be an awful lot of people voting emotionally or directed by emotions. And you've mentioned before, that it might be on immigration. So do you see what I'm saying? There's I worry about people not knowing what they're voting for.
But I would be very risky of going down that road if I might, because I know you didn't mean this, but actually it could be a very patronising view of a voter. And that actually, I've learnt one thing, whether I've won or I've lost, is actually the voter generally gets it right. So there are a lot of dynamics at play. And as in immigration, I don't think this will be settled on business either. I mean, I was tired of hearing Nick Clegg say in the last Parliament, 3 million jobs depend on whether we're in Europe or not. It is utter nonsense. The implication of that is BMW will not sell cars in the UK if we come out of Europe. We all know that's nonsense. Will there be tariffs on them? Maybe, maybe not. That depends on your trade agreement. So I think it's a very complex discussion to have.
I agree with you, Nick, and I don't mean to be sort of patronising about anything. I'm just saying the lack of information or the lack of time that people have to look into it, and then they're all of a sudden asked to vote on something. So I'm worried about
risky democracy.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm worried about the communication that's available.
One final reflection, I think, on kind of what are the impacts for the industry. And I absolutely take your point, Nick, about the kind of restraints on our ability as a nation to enter into trade agreements with developing markets. But I know several agencies from the work that I do who have used the emerging markets as a way of undercutting competitors in foreign markets. So people who've gone to China and had steelworks fabricated and then shipped those steelworks on ships across into the US with Chinese labour so they could figure out how to put it all together because nobody could read the instructions because they're written in Chinese, and to do that at 30% cost saving. So the industry itself, our industry, the event industry, is very adroit at working with people who supply things in a different way and taking advantage of those developing markets. So I don't necessarily agree that trade...
Been so.
It has been so, yeah.
And that's exactly what we used to do. We used to look at Singapore or the Chinese mainland and where was the most cost-effective place to do it and still get a reasonable degree of quality. And I appreciate everything that you guys have said, but just to bring it back to events, are European events going to be affected or moved to other countries, someone's asked, in response to this? Not a question of, you'll still be able to buy a BMW car here with or without a tariff, as Nick has said. Would it affect any of your corporate clients having an event in the UK as opposed to the European mainland?
Definitely.
And how does their thought process work?
So, if the UK, Britain's great, got a great brand, and it's a very, very, especially London, is an extremely popular destination. If there's any hint of process that needs to be followed, any barriers to get people into the country, via European countries, I think it would just be perceived. Perhaps it's not as much of a problem, but it would be perceived as a problem, and they quite frankly will vote for their feet. I mean, we've got many international clients, and I know for a fact that they'd think again.
And Simon?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question in the sense that will it change people's behaviour? If we look at an independent source of information, the ICA rankings, whether they are for destinations or countries, show that Europe, including here in the UK, remains very, very popular. So our clients who are buying and saying, I want to go here or I want to go there.
Second to Paris.
Yeah. Are saying, actually, we really like European destinations in terms of capital cities, and we really like European destinations in terms of countries to go to. I think in the top 10 ICA countries, I think it's Singapore and USA are the only two countries that aren't European. So there's some evidence saying clients, our clients who we listen to, like Europe. So we should bear that in mind.
So, Jeremy, do you think that's the popularity of the UK is because we're part of that European trading bloc, or is it the fact that people like UK best? And would we lose any of that if we lost our association?
I think there was a danger, but I think there are bigger factors in play here. I'm going to mention the H word, Heathrow. I think that's a much bigger threat to the popularity of London than us leaving the EU,
We're supposed to
in my view.
Make a 2-minute warning if we make
Okay, I'm sorry, Nick. It was a 4-second warning.
It's all right. I'll talk.
It's okay. In my view, I could be wrong, but yes, there is a risk. But again, we just don't know.
Before I comment on Heathrow, can I just comment on that? And I'll leave you to dodge Heathrow until later.
It's not in the debate tonight.
Excellent. So I'm delighted.
What we are interested in is, European events, will they move to other countries if we scare people off?
Well, I think it's quite interesting. We should look at the playing field now. At the moment, we are not part of what is called the Schengen Agreement. The Schengen Agreement is essentially a group of 7 countries, I think it is, built up around the Benelux countries originally, that allowed people to pass between them without a passport.
Borders, yeah.
So very interesting, has lots of dimensions for the immigration and freedom movement of labour movement. But we don't have that. And I think it would be worth looking at visitors to this country, delegates to this country, and deciding how many of them are going to venues that are hosted, say, in Paris, because actually it's easier and less bureaucratic to get to Paris, perhaps. It's easier to move around from Paris if you're flying from China or elsewhere. And do they rule out London because they think it's a little bit more complicated to get in, it's awkward to get visas? And I think there would be some truth in that. And you might think that that leans towards saying we should be part of Europe. No, not necessarily. I think if you look at one issue in isolation, it's easy perhaps to make a case. But actually, the real source of the problem is the way we don't make ourselves attractive to business delegates to come to this country and ease the visa process, and you don't need to be part of a very expensive trading bloc to do that. So I think it's a really difficult question to ask. I think people are coming to top destinations in the world for all sorts of reasons. I am not sure that I've ever seen in a bid document in my day, which admittedly is 6 years ago, where they said we want to go to an EU destination. And I'm not sure how much it does necessarily factor in the key thinking of an event agency that might be recommending it. You would know better than that than me.
And Jeremy, can I just ask you, in your capacity as an interviewer, or the politicians and so forth that you talk to, how do they actually view the UK relationship with Europe? Do they see ourselves as being part of Europe, or do they see ourselves as a standalone on the outside? Are we, you know,
it depends who you speak to. No, you mentioned Schengen. I think it's a bit of an anathema, isn't it, to I think the Brits and the people I've interviewed, politicians or otherwise. I mean, moving around without a passport. I mean, I don't know. I forget the last time. I'm not part of the Schengen, but when was the last time I showed a passport to someone? I don't know. I'm trying to think, in France or Belgium or something. I think you just flash it and it's sort of. Okay, so I'm not quite sure what that difference is. In terms of politicians, I think people are, broadly speaking, they like the idea, and I think whether it's local politicians or national politicians, they like the idea of just ease of movement. So it's a bit, I don't know, your question is a bit, it's a very broad question. They're very, yeah, it is, yeah. Of course they're broad, but I think most people like the idea of freedom of movement, ease of access, certainly. But again, I don't necessarily think we need to be in a trading bloc to do that.
If we come back to the whole question about trade, if you talk to the Oxford Street Traders Association and ask them what they think about Schengen, they're very clear. They see huge numbers, particularly from China, one of the developing markets we've mentioned earlier, going into Paris and spending shed loads of cash compared to Oxford Street. And the reason is it's easier, and it has been easier for a long time, for them to go into Europe within the Schengen area and move around. They can go to Paris, they can go to Milan, they can go to Berlin, and they've got one visa. They want to come here, they have to pay a hell of a lot more money, and it takes a lot longer to process, and they only get a visa for here. Now, there are changes being made and improvements being made to that, which are all to the good, but the reality is right now there are kind of impediments to kind of trade because of where we are, and exiting Europe would just make that worse.
And on the experience economy side of things, which is happening more and more, where traditional exhibitions and traditional events and so forth are being complemented or amplified by the experience economy, do you feel that fast-moving reaction that you get with companies and brands where they want to do something incredibly quickly, will that be changed by an in or an out?
Again, only in the sense of what impediments to, what obstacles, what barriers might pop up that are unseen now. We can guess at some of them, but I think, yes, you know, anything that makes it a little more difficult to do business restrains the ability to be flexible and fast and fleet of foot. So that's my concern. I have no idea what they might
Nicky,
be.
you work a lot with car companies. We mentioned BMW earlier on. You work with Citroën.
Yeah.
What's their view?
They don't care too much, to be honest.
Bless them.
Yeah. No, they have probably less of a view of it. But the beverage industries definitely do have a view on it, and in some of our other clients, Sony in particular. So but the one thing I just wonder whether the debate is. I'm still battling by thinking, why am I debating the negative? I still don't understand what the positives are. Let's leave. What is it? Why? If it's not broke, why try and fix it? Why would I, however small or big or the impacts are, why would I change it? How is it detrimental? And maybe Nick knows more about that.
Well, I'd gladly answer that, but we haven't got time. No, I think it's a fair question. What is wrong with the EU? You will not answer that entirely in business terms. But let me give you one example in business terms. We all talk about the single market. The theory is we can just go from country to country, trade, set up businesses, free of tax, free to move. Actually, the single market that was founded, funny enough, it was signed into law in this country by the biggest Eurosceptic, which was Margaret Thatcher way back in 1987. The single market actually only operates in goods. It does not genuinely exist in services. You are all in the services industry. 70% of the economic trade in Europe, all the European countries, is in services, in what we do, in architecture, in financial services, etc. And yet there is no single market in services. I cannot go to Germany and set up a design agency, an architects, a lawyer's firm, without jumping through as many barriers as I would have to jump through if I was going to China or the Middle East. In fact, I can do it quicker in the Middle East and even in America. Why has that failed? It has failed because the countries who have so much of their business in services are basically protective. To be an architect firm in Germany, you have to be a member of the Institute of Architects in Germany. You cannot be a member of the Institute of Architects in Germany unless you have trained in Germany. And when you have trained, you then have to seek insurance. You cannot seek insurance to be an architect unless you've actually been trading in Germany for 5 years. And on it goes. And no government has wrestled with that. And if they did, GDP in Europe would be up by 3% on what we're doing now.
But putting it back to I'm kind of the minor spot on the map that says, but hang on a minute, European clients are buying our creativity. That's a service. There doesn't seem to be.
But are they buying it because we're in the EU or because we're good at it?
They're buying it because we're good.
Good at it, I hope.
Yeah. in terms of the numbers that you get from Europe, you've got the big six like aerospace, automotive, then you've got services like media, which are architects and so forth, and creative come into it. That's actually bigger than the financial estimate. That's worth around 69 billion. The finance is worth around 65. Aerospace around 20, automotive somewhere in the region of 30, pharma somewhere in between the two. So the numbers are pretty big. And those architects that you mentioned are probably employing architects who have been trained in Taiwan, in Beijing, in London, and in Amsterdam.
And I think you're right. I mean, you are right, Nick. But the issue is, people would have to jump through the same hoops if they wanted to establish an architectural practice here in the UK. And also, in the UK, particularly if we look at some of the comms, the kind of broader comms areas, we have world-class digital processing outfits, not a million miles away from where we're sitting right now. And they do employ people from all over the world. And they do reach out and work with people in Berlin overnight, and they'll work with somebody in South America overnight, down in Australia, in order to process through computing kind of the latest CGI stuff that they're working on. So I'm thinking of people like the Mill and the Frame Store. There are no barriers to that kind of British creativity. Whether we're in or out, we're still quite good at all of that.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that is a key point, because you're looking for, if you like, you were searching around for positives, you were really saying. And I think we have to go back to that basic premise in our question, is look, why do we want to firmly entrench ourselves in a trading union that is in decline? In the world, forgive me, it'll come back to me, the organisation, World Trade Organisation, I believe it is, has predicted that actually Europe is currently 37% of the world economy. It is going to be 25% by 2030. I want to be aligning Britain, and I want to see this sector aligned with the sectors that are growing, the economies that are growing, and the trading blocks that are growing. And I want to be able to form, as Britain, trading agreements that allow us to trade freely with those organisations. And yet that is not something we can do as a national right. It is done by a commissioner who is unelected, sits in Brussels, and tries to make a negotiation and an agreement on behalf of all the member states of Europe. And yet, if you are Norway or Switzerland, you have some benefits of the European Union, and you have the freedom to make your own agreements. Is that really such a troubling prospect to do what we do in business every day, which is remain flexible, dynamic, and responsive to the changing economic needs?
Does David Cameron, is he not trying to negotiate a better position? Why is he doing that?
He is trying to change, and as I said at the beginning, I think we give him absolute support to try and negotiate the best possible deal for Britain, and then form an opinion. And I would urge everyone to do that.
And does one of these, forgive me, I don't know, but does one of these negotiations include having the freedom to set up trade negotiations with other...
Well, unfortunately, I'm definitely not at the seat of table now, and I certainly wasn't really at the table last time. But I think what's so frustrating is I wrote a document with a number of other colleagues, which was called A Fresh Start for Europe. If you are incredibly bored or perhaps doing something you can't sleep, get it off the web. There is a lovely section on how we could... there is a lovely section on how, without treaty change, which, remember, requires all 27 members to sign, you could liberalise the services market and allow what we would call smaller groups within Europe, like-minded groups, to go ahead and form separate trade agreements. And it doesn't need treaty change. It could almost be done in a weekend's work in Europe. I wish him well. I don't know if that's on the table for negotiation, but I think that's what we will see, and I'm told we'll see in February.
So in terms of European shows moving to other countries, do you still see that something that we touched on earlier on, do we think that would actively happen?
I think someone who is running a show is going to look at what is the most profitable for them at the less costs and meet the needs of their target audience. Do I think that being a member of the EU or not weighs heavily on them? No, I don't particularly. As I say, it's never been in a brief I've ever received that we have to do that. Will businesses, however, who commission that work, take a careful look at where their businesses can profit best from? Yes, I'm sure they will.
A lot of the people in the room here work for large organisers who own extremely large events, and they purchase on a global level and they deliver on a local level. So, Simon, for instance, your UBMs or your I2Is or so forth who have a portfolio of events that they might put on the UK, when they put them on the European mainland, would an in or an out, would that change the way that they use suppliers? Would they use less people from the UK?
My instinct is that it might just come down to our cost.
I'm thinking about these guys' jobs.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I was talking to some folks recently who said that there's not much interaction between the UK events industry and our European colleagues. And in fact, that's true. There's not a huge kind of interchange of ideas and thinking, and we just don't talk to them very much. But the one thing they all tell their clients is that we're 20% more expensive generally. And I think that might be true. And it might be true because we're better. Our technicians are better, our designers are better, the digital folks are better. We're better often than some of the people, creatively better particularly, than some of the people we bump into operating in the European market. Now, will that therefore impact on people's choices? I suspect it might. And it comes down to, can we compete on those costs, on that cost basis?
To at a very granular level, when we're pitching, the margins, and the guessing, the cost base is enormous. So even something like we might have to spend some extra time to get some visas together, we can't immediately react, or we have to, there's a cost to carnets. Our suppliers will say, well, hang on a minute, Nick, that's going to cost me half a day. So everything will have an impact. That is a worry. Now, that might be a short-sighted view, Nick, but it is a reality. And if you don't count your pennies today, you won't be there tomorrow. So, we have an immediate kind of responsibility to try and negate anything or any barrier that has a cost implication.
Jeremy, are we 20 years of working in conferences and working with events? Are we more creative? Would we lose any of that edge?
I think Simon's got it absolutely spot on. I'm just thinking, somebody mentioned IMEX before, coming up later in the year. I would like to see world-class locations in this country, real world-class locations in this country. I want to see better infrastructure. And we mentioned Heathrow already. We mentioned there's HS2 coming up, HS3. Why is it we can't have the sort of things we see in the United States or Germany? That, to me, is what it's about. That is, to me, a much bigger picture. I want to see. What's the biggest hall now in this country? Was it event location?
Oh, XL.
Holds how many
the
people?
The biggest one is XL in London, and then you've got NEC.
In terms of bums and seats, how many people?
Hotel space that tends to dictate.
Yeah, I'm not saying it is. Okay, fine. So let's look at all infrastructure. Is what point I'm making.
Yeah, no.
And we're just sort of scatting around the edges here. I think that's what we need. We need to sort of, have faith in the UK.
I would say I think we can look at inward investment and reasons to drive up the UK as a destination of choice, and that is absolutely crucial. It's very, very important for the industry, whether you're in the EU or not. It's crucial. But I think this decision is as much about our export markets. The future of Britain, we are still trading at a deficit. Every year we are basically importing more than we are exporting. All right? In my view, that is an unsustainable long-term position. Now, what I would like to see is that we build those relationships and those opportunities right across the world. And that doesn't mean to the exclusion of Europe. And it strikes me that because the EU is actually not designed to be the most competitive place in the world to do business, that it is now intervening in domestic social and employment legislation. The fact that it is terribly unaccountable, as I've learned to my cost. You might not like politicians, or you might like them, but at least you can get rid of them that are making decisions every few years. But you cannot do that with such a democratic deficit in Europe. So why not free ourselves of constraints to go and be very bold about where we build our new business and our new exports, where actually we'll be doing carnets or whatever agreements may be out there. But that's the future. That will redress our trade balance. That will make us a wealthier nation to invest in exactly what we want to do. And frankly, I think it will help drive this business, which is already exporting over something like 2 billion of exhibitions alone. And over half of that, well over half of that, is outside of Europe.
And in terms of exporting, we already export, as we've discussed earlier on, and Simon alluded to it. We've already got an awful lot of talent, which is extremely good, which is working all over Europe as it stands at the moment. If we were to have a change of heart and leave the European community, what would happen to all the British workers who are out there at the moment, the 2.1 million Brits who are living in Europe or whatever? What would happen to them?
Actually, it's a very interesting question, and the FT carries a great pointer to this. You'll have to Google it because I haven't got the link. But it actually talks about, if we vote on, say, July the 30th or whenever it is, and we vote to come out, actually there is 2 years where you remain in the EU as a minimum to negotiate all of those issues, including Brits who live abroad. I know this debate in immigration seems to forget that there's quite a lot of Brits that actually go and become immigrants elsewhere. And actually they have protected rights, they wouldn't be slung out of Spain, and you're not going to see people slung out of the UK either. just for all sorts of reasons, not least the Human Rights Act. So it is a very complex situation on which you then put a layer of a government trying to renegotiate a relationship with Europe, which, by the way, probably wants to still do business with us since they sell far more to us than we sell to them.
Did we pull out of quite a lot of the Human Rights Act?
No, we did not. We have not pulled out of a single thing on the Human Rights Act, which incidentally has absolutely nothing to do with the European Union. It is often confused. It is completely separate.
You just mentioned that it was going to protect all the people who are living
abroad.
Yeah,
because the Human Rights Act, which is basically stems from a post-war agreement, we subscribe to that through a convention, and that convention has nothing to do with Europe. So people are allowed to employ it. It was enshrined in British law in 1997. It allows you to seek satisfaction through the European Court of Human Rights, which includes not kicking you out of your country.
Nick, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but one of the fundamental principles of the common market, the European Union, is the freedom of movement of people.
Yeah.
And that's not going to be renegotiated. That's one of the things that is there. And as an industry, and anybody in this room who spends any time at all travelling around the UK, going into conference centres or hotels, will know your chance of meeting a native-born English person standing at 3 o'clock in the morning at the load-in bay going, hello, welcome, is very, very rare. Yeah. What you're most likely to meet is one of the 100,000 Eastern Europeans who've joined us here in the UK and work in the hospitality sector, particularly hotels. And they've come here because they've seen an opportunity. They've taken on jobs that a lot of folks over here have said, that's not for me because actually I have to get up really early and work really long hours. And they're doing very well out of it. And they're helping our industry deliver excellent levels of customer service right across the country. If we leave Europe, we stop that flow of labour and we stop that flow of kind of heft that helps our industry prosper. I was at the Barbican last night, and there's one of the livery companies has a venue there within the precincts of the Barbican. The woman who runs that venue runs 2 other venues for other livery companies. She arrived here 8 years ago. She's Polish. She started as a waitress in a restaurant, and by sheer hard work, she has now become the head of 3 venues for livery companies here in London, because she applied herself. She saw an opportunity, she worked hard, she's prospered, and she's made her life here in the UK. That's one of the, I think, tremendous benefits of being part of the European Union, that we allow that kind of thing to happen. And it does a huge amount for our industry.
Come back for a minute.
There's very little to disagree with in what you said there, except one thing which is not quite correct. Norway, for example, as I said, it has its agreement. It actually has retained in that trading bloc, the Scandinavian trading bloc effectively, the right to freedom of movement of labour. That agreement still works. You and I can go in there as European citizens. But I think we all know in this room the question of freedom of movement of labour will be very important to business, but it cannot be, in the current climate, removed from the question of immigration and security. And that is why the voice of business does need to be heard, whether it supports it or not, because actually that will dominate this European debate, and it is fundamentally a negative debate at the moment. And I'm not saying that that is a good thing. But again, it comes back to my point on labour, is that by saying we leave the European Union, we leave all that we don't want behind, is exactly the opposite of the case, because we have to renegotiate our arrangements. And it would be perfectly legitimate to say, well, if we're going to have that, why don't we stay in? I don't agree, but that is a perfectly legitimate position to take.
And I'm just going to let Nicky come back, who wants to make a comment on this, and then we're just going to go around the table and open a couple of questions and to close off.
Yeah, so here's the thing, being Dutch, Britain has a great reputation and is seen as a very, executive senior partner in the arrangements that we've got at the moment. So, we're a big fish in a small pond. Do we want to be a small fish in a big pond? And that's it.
And so can I close off, and I'll go to Jeremy first. One of the questions that we got, and it seems like a fitting one to finish on, since we're actually here about the event industry and business in the first place. So, in your opinion or your experience, Jeremy, how much business does the event industry generate from the UK? From the EU, sorry. How much does the UK generate from the EU?
My opinion, or...
In your opinion, yeah.
Okay. No, I think a tremendous amount. But I don't think it'll be affected by this country's exit, in my view. The arguments that Nick has beautifully put forward this evening.
Bless. Nick, it's your opinion.
I think the business could actually be even better had the single market been completed. I would say, in my experience to now, I'm not sure it's true, that many of the businesses that have grown from just the 2-3-man operations over the last 2 decades probably first started in business and did that. But do I think it's the future? Absolutely not. It's part of the future. And on the point of, which I think is very well made, about do we want to be part of a big fish in a big pond or a small fish in a big pond, I think it is worth remembering that we shouldn't be too shy. We are the 5th largest trading nation. We're the 11th largest exporting nation, which shows you what we've got to do. And I think being 5th is very good, being 11th isn't, but the way to do that is to export beyond Europe.
And Nicky,
Sorry, what was the question?
how much business does the event industry generate from the EU?
I absolutely have no idea. I'll be honest
But
with you.
do
I
you
know
think
that, to
you
be
get
honest,
more business from it? Is it good for business or bad for business?
No, I think most of our clients are UK based and then go outwards into the EU. But you know, that's our position. But that doesn't mean to say that we would necessarily think that we should support it the other way. I'm just saying I've got some more information about the positives of leaving, and I'll take that into consideration.
Simon, do you think the event industry benefits from the business from the EU?
My impression is that it does overall. Quantifying that and saying it's X, very, very difficult to do.
Yeah, we can't do that.
But in terms of the kind of perception of what Europe offers our clients, Europe is a really rich offer. All of us in Europe. It's a fantastic offer, and I think that's probably the thing I hang on to. If it's the biggest consumer market in the world, we're part of it, and I think staying part of that has a compelling storyline. And also, the other thing we haven't really mentioned is, what do other nations of the world think of us even contemplating leaving it? And the answer to that, if you look at the Americas, and particularly North America, diplomats in Washington think we would be crazy to come out of the EU. And they are trading partners. They are people we do business with as an industry, and we mustn't lose sight of the fact
17% of our trade.
there's a reputational thing going on here. And yes, we want to develop in emerging markets. What would they say? What would China say if we decided to come out of Europe? I don't know what they'd say, but my guess is they'd say something in Chinese.
The States want us to have a seat in Europe because we can influence it.
Of course, yes.
Most profound.
And on that superb note, if anyone speaks Mandarin, have we got any questions from the audience to any particular member of Ash over there in the corner? I'll come to you, sir.
What was that last question you just raised, Aaron?
It was, how much business does the event industry generate from the EU?
Can I ask a question? Out of the audience, how many
If you use your little handheld thing, you'll actually be recorded.
business out of the EU? How many people in the audience generate business out of the EU?
Do you mean clients that are in the EU that you win business from or go and do business in Europe? I think there is a difference, and I think it's worth...
So, all right, so you generate business from working with clients in the EU.
Yeah.
Okay, can you count them all? Just roughly.
Yes, around half.
15?
Yeah.
15?
Yeah.
How many people would it affect if we left the EU?
Well, those 15, obviously.
Not necessarily. They're still going to buy BMWs. Yeah.
I think
I've gone through you're talking about cars, and I've been in this business now for 55 years. But the problem that
55.
work, the amount of work that's involved in doing all that, it takes time. And costume.
It's time from another time.
You can never replace. You can be competitive in the cost of the equipment, the venue, whatever. But when you lose time, your most experienced people are putting together a card.
Yeah, that's something that we've got.
It takes hours, and it's horrible. I wouldn't want to do that again.
Sir, thank you.
It strikes me we've got a privileged position already within Europe. We've already said we're not in Schengen. We don't even use the euro. And hopefully the Prime Minister will bring back one or two other areas where we will be exempted from following the flock. And one question that hasn't been dealt with by the panel, we talk about being a small fish in a bigger pond, but we could be an even smaller fish because the whole question of devolution has meant that it is quite possible, and I know people say that Scotland wouldn't be accepted into the European Union, but clearly this would be a major shift for how the Scottish people view Britain being in or out of Europe. A lot of the event business that we do goes to Glasgow, goes to Edinburgh, and indeed a lot of the organisations in this room have business subsidiaries based both in Scotland and in England. So would the members of the panel like to comment on what would happen to Britain? And if we were only talking about England being out of the European Union, would that change your perspective?
Anyone care to pick that up?
I think it would change, because one of the things is, Britain per se for global brands has an interesting variety of offers, which includes Scotland. Now, when David Cameron came out last year to announce the results of the referendum, somewhere behind him in number 10 Downing Street was an exhausted special advisor who writes his speeches, who was filing away the other speech, the speech that would have been Cameron apologising for the breakup of the United Kingdom, the speech that would have been saying, sorry, we have lost Scotland. And that speech exists. It's there somewhere buried in the archives in number 10 Downing Street. And I suspect that if we did come out, the Scottish government would move to look at that again, and Cameron might well have to get that speech out and make it one day. And it's part of the, as an industry, we're pushing the nations as attractive destinations for our clients on a global basis. To lop off the top end of the country, just because they've got funny accents and wear skirts, isn't right, because I think that would really do us damage in terms of our overall offer.
We could do another EventHuddle on that.
We could, yes.
Right on the skirts.
Another question.
Some of you may detect my Scottish accent, actually, so in that debate.
Panel, may I introduce a jock and a jock and a frock?
Indeed. So my question is going back to the opening point actually around carnies, and also what Nick said about the difference between goods and services. Now, my background is in events and leisure operations, primarily roadshows, so I've had to deal with carnies going to Switzerland and carnies going to Norway, and it is quite bureaucratic. As Paul said, it's time as much as anything else. So I would not like to have to do that going across the channel, for instance. But the point regards services and goods. I think our business is very much about goods as it is services, from obviously from the temporary import perspective. Every event and roadshow we do has its tangible elements. So there may be an impact there on our sector that perhaps, particularly when we've got specialised stuff, specialised equipment, do we look to source that locally and have local labour and local supply rather than temporarily importing goods? And then that's a consideration for me. The other thing as well is we're moving into a business where we're actually going to be importing hardware product from the USA and then distributing it within Europe with VAR agreements as part of a value-add service offering. So it is very important for us because we're dealing with goods in the trading sense as well as event services. So I want to kind of understand what the impacts are around our business, which I think is very relevant for us.
Can I just comment first
Please.
of all, very briefly on Scotland, because we are kind of trying to get one referendum ahead there. I think just reflect on a moment what drove the EU together. It was essentially a fear, deep fear held by Germany in particular, that it would return to conflict, return to fascism, and it was born basically out of a belief that they would never, ever seek a European war again. It is in the DNA of many of those nations, and I suspect in Holland included, that coming together as Europe was really important, and that's driven it. And in many ways, that's been enormously successful. I'm not so convinced, actually, that we think like that in the United Kingdom. I'm not so convinced that the Scottish, whilst I believe passionately the Scottish nationalists would immediately try and seek another referendum, I don't believe the Scottish people would decide their future exclusively whether they should be in and out of Europe, for all the reasons we've talked about, whether it's about now or the future. And turning to your question very briefly, I'm not going to answer the detail of that question. I was getting exhausted just thinking about what you were proposing there. But I do come back to the central premise, and I think it's worth saying. We probably have all these horrific regulations to go through when we are exporting to North America, when we're exporting elsewhere. Fact of the matter, whilst there may be a significant presence in this room who are dependent on Europe, the real question is do you want to just continue looking as Europe as the future market, which is an inevitable decline, or, as you would enthusiastically, overcome those regulatory barriers if you were trying to clinch your first sale in a new territory, a new country outside of Europe. So I kind of feel that perspective should overhang our conversation and resist the temptation on all issues to necessarily vote just on the here and now, which, of course, many people will understandably do.
And can we, with respect and our normal excellent manners that we have at our table here, leave the last comment with our lady?
Oh,
so Nicky,
so
please.
kind. What can I say? No,
anything you want.
I just, I'm glad I was part of this debate. I think I've seen some other sides to it that I was unaware of. But I would worry a little bit about, even if we could negotiate, negotiating powers, if we went out and we could negotiate, things take so long. And I think, at the moment, if the business was very, very buoyant and it could take a few knocks and we could be a bit patient over 2 years, well, fine, but I don't think it can.
Yeah, Nick's right. There is a 2-year clause, but it's more likely to negotiate with all 27 countries, which you'd have to do. It's going to take nearer 4 years.
Okay, but I will guarantee you now that some of my clients will leave London, and that will change our business. Fine.
On that gloomy note, thank you all so much.
What about the vote?
Well, 2 things to close off. First and foremost is the next event will be held on the 11th of February, and the topic will be equally cheerful as tonight. It will be terror threat and security. Are we doing enough to keep our delegates and our events safe? Actually, it's a fantastic topic because it really does need to be looked at in terms of physical and our digital security as well. And then the last word really has to go to our audience. So who's against being in the EU?
It's the same man.
No, we had 2. Yeah, fine. Good man.
100% improvement.
It was actually two before, sorry.
Oh, was it
Stable.
2 before? Was
yeah.
it?
And
I wondered if anybody in the industry, Visit Britain or London and Partners or EvCom or one of the associations is going to look, or organisations will look at this and go, here's 10 points for, here's 10 points against.
Yeah,
and
communication.
Because I think this is quite an interesting debate. I came to sort of understand it more because I didn't really understand it at all. And I'm not sure I understand it much better. But it would be good as an output of this for someone to go, do you know what? Here's 10 points for or against.
Splendid
in
idea.
a really simple, tangible way that someone like me could understand.
And we could just like it or not like it. Thank you very much indeed. Greatly appreciated. Please enjoy the hospitality.